Hello, and welcome to our second week of classes. If you are new to the course, please review the syllabus and the videos that I've made introducing the course. They are all linked in the welcome announcement. Today, as it is the beginning of our second week, I want to talk a little bit about historiography and bias, which are two things that I think are very important to understand because it's part of what I'm trying to get to with some of the questions I'm asking you in these discussions. Now, as a reminder, the top post for all discussions, especially starting this week, I'm a little more tolerant from the first week because so many people drop and add the course as we go along. But the structure for the discussions is that your top post is due on Friday. It is due by midnight Friday night with your 3 peer comments, and often, as in this past week, they are guided. You have to respond to the other questions that were asked or respond to someone who addressed the other questions, are to be done by Monday. And there was an exception this week because of the holiday yesterday, but from this point out, top post is due on Friday with the peer comments due by Monday. And if you are late on posting that top post, is 10% per day. So you don't want to be messing with that. And that applies to all of your responses. All right. So with that in mind, then, let's talk about something called historiography. This is from the Princeton website, Princeton University Library. But this is a standard definition that is used across almost all history courses. Historiography it deals with the writing of history. In the broadest sense, it is a study of the history of history as it has been described by historians. It does, though, have numerous facets. What we are looking at in terms of what we're doing with this course is understanding how interpretations of history have changed, because they do. We started this in week 1 with the idea that I tried to present, particularly through the Indian Ocean Trade video and through the video on the Renaissance, whether it was actually a thing or not. This idea of challenging what we know from the past. And many of the reasons why interpretations change over time is because new information comes to light. If you were in my Civ 1 class, you would have seen a video last week on bias and historiography, in which I used an article that was published a couple of weeks ago about the discovery of a monolithic underwater wall that was discovered off the coast of France. And the dating on that wall puts it over 7,000 years BCE, which means it was built by hunter-gatherers. And this is really fascinating because this would require a level of organization that we, up until now, didn't believe hunter-gatherers had because we didn't think their populations were big enough for that. But this is going to completely reinvent our ideas about the hunter-gatherers and how they operated prior to the creation of agriculture and settling down. So this is a really big deal. It's going to change a lot of things. So part of the reason historiography, or the history of history, changes, or why history itself changes, is because we find new things. One of the other reasons, though, is because historians themselves, while we love to study the past, we live in the present, whatever our present is. And we are heavily influenced by what's going on in our present. And the things that we think about in our own daily lives are often things that we then turn around and apply to the past. So history changes as ideas in the present change as well. One of the best examples of this is that up until about the 1960s, almost all of the areas of the study of history were what we call the big monolithic ideas like politics, military, economic, religion, the history of great men, the idea that things happened in societies because of the leaders, and that those were who we talked about most of the time. But in the 1960s, and to be fair, it actually kind of starts in the 1950s and 60s throughout the Western world, and that would be Western Europe and all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere that are that were basically founded, colonized, and run by Western empires, there was a growing civil rights movement. And this movement obviously was looking for political and economic equality for minorities, particularly racial minorities, but also gender, sexual minorities, people who had been relegated to inferior positions because of being female or being gay or being African American or being of African descent or being Native American or being Hispanic American or, again, depending on if you were in the United States or Western Europe, being from some racial or ethnic minority that had not been given equal treatment. And as the civil rights movement spread and these ideas spread, more and more of these minority peoples began to enter colleges and to want to study the history of their own ethnicity or race or gender or whatever, which created the field of social history, in which we study history from the perspective of other peoples. And obviously, this was almost 60 years ago. Now this is very much foundational in almost all history courses. Certainly, it's a big part of the push in world history, particularly, which has a big element of colonialization, particularly in the last 600 years. And we'll be discussing that in detail. In fact, we've already started effectively discussing that. So a big part of what I was trying to get you to in this discussion of the world prior to Columbus is that there are other things going on in the world than what's going on in Western Europe. Western Europe is emerging from the period of, the medieval world, as we call it, which was a world in which the majority of people did not read or write. They spent their time literally working from sun up to sundown most of the time in order to provide food, enough food for them to eat, but then also enough food to pay their taxes to their governments, or their kings, as it were, and the middle level administrators between them and their king. We start this course literally in that period, and the Renaissance is effectively a period when intellectual ideas begin to expand throughout Italy, the Italian city-states, but there are very specific reasons why this happens, and most of it has to do with the fact that the Italian city-states have seen the economic boom of the Crusades. So this starts the Renaissance there, even though if you watch the John Green video, then you know that there is a question about whether that actually was a thing, because such a small percentage of the population was directly affected by it. Anyway, the point to all of this is that our view of history today is changing, and we look more today to study the history of the past, not from the perspective of the elites who left most of the records, but to use some of those records, read between the lines, to find out what life was like for the common person in that age. Okay, so one of the reasons why you are taking or required to take history classes is because we teach you a certain way of thinking called critical thinking. Historiography is part of that because that gets you to consider not just how we tell the story of history, but how that story and those interpretations change. One of the other things that we do is look at what is called bias or perspective. Now, history uses different types of sources. We use primary sources, which are documents written in the past by people who were there. And that's part of why, as I was saying, when history changed when historiography changed in the 1960s, a lot of that was because all of the historical documents we'd had pretty much up until the 1800s were written by the elite because they were the only people who could read and write. So we didn't have a lot of the history of people from below, the people who were doing the hard work and the labor of producing everything. That about 90% of the population that didn't have the ability to read and write. Some of that begins to change by the 12, 13, 1400s, which is another reason why we start here. In the Western world, one of the things that ties the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment periods all together is the evolution of the printing press. But the printing press had existed in other parts of the world for much longer. The Chinese had the printing press by like the 900s. So this is, again, one of those differences in interpretation and perspective. Primary source material then becomes easier to acquire with the creation of the printing press, and that now we have many more books and things that were published in the 1500s in Western Europe to look at. Again, many of these, though, were entirely from the perspective of the elite, the people who could read and write. Even though with the invention of the printing press, literacy does begin to spread. And we see a lot of that as one of the focal points of the Reformation, which is something to think about. But when we look at primary sources and when we look at secondary and tertiary sources, we still have to take into account the fact that they are products of the time period in which they are written, and they all have a certain perspective, bias, worldview. Some of the easiest examples of this are when you look at almost anything written in the past that talks about slavery, because slavery has existed throughout all of human history. Not just the horrific transatlantic slave trade that we're going to talk about in this course, but even prior to that, back in the ancient world, in fact, when the first civilizations began, slavery comes into being because no one wants to do the really, really hard work of producing the food. So when you read a lot of primary source material, things written by people in the past, you'll see them talk about slavery as if it is an everyday thing, because it is an everyday thing, and thinking about it as if it's okay, because for them it was okay. Often when you are reading things from the past, you'll come up against the bias or perspective of the person writing it, because it will disagree with how we fundamentally think about things today. And that is actually one of the best ways to find yourself acknowledging or recognizing bias in primary sources, is because it often has to do with things that we just don't think the same way about anymore today. The same thing applies historiographically, because history is written by humans, and humans have bias because we are not omniscient, and therefore we filter all the information through the preset filters in our brain that develop from the time before we're born up until, well, throughout our lives. We can all look at the same period of history and develop different theories about it and different ideas, because we prioritize certain events differently from the way other people do. In fact, one of the ways to recognize perspective or bias in a narrative history, a secondary or tertiary source, is by thinking about what the historian who wrote it left out, because that often plays a big role in how they interpret events. And often the way they determine what's important is by prioritizing the things that they choose to use to support their arguments. So again, a big part of what you are taking this course for is to learn how to recognize bias or perspective, to challenge that, to think about other ways that something could be interpreted, and to basically critically think, to think past what is on the page and ask the question of why it's on the page. All right, so we're going to be doing that a lot in this course. And in fact, one of the very first things I want you to do is watch a video on what the difference between history and the past is, because they are two different things. The past is everything that has happened before now. History is a narrative that tries to put certain things that have happened in the past into a meaningful explanation for something, and usually something that is even still occurring in the present. And that's another big focus of what we'll be talking about. All right, so with that in mind, I encourage you to consider these things. And again, what historiography is, what bias or perspective is, what types of sources there are, are primary, those things written in the past by people who were there; secondary, an historian's explanation for why certain things happened or didn't happen; and tertiary, the big collections of history that we use to teach with or to give general explanations. Tertiary sources are normally textbooks, encyclopedias, other sources of just big, broad, general information. Encyclopedia Britannica is one, etc. So think about all of those and think about them in terms of critical thinking. Okay, and with that in mind, I want to kind of go over the discussion questions themselves and talk about them. And again, how I grade. First off, let's go to how I grade, because this is going to be important for all of you. I want to go down to our, there you are, discussion rubric. Okay, so here's the discussion rubric. As you can tell, it is based on effectively 5 criterion: general knowledge in your top post, critical thinking in your top post, grammar, but mostly APA citation, and then general knowledge in your peer comments and critical thinking in your peer comments. So that adds up to, depending on where you are, if you are excellent, it's worth the full value of the category, which is 25, 25 and 25 for your top post for critical thinking and general knowledge, 10% or 10 points for your APA citation and so forth, and then for your peer comments, 20 and 20. Then if it's satisfactory, which is effectively the B grade, it's going to be 21, 21, 8, 18 and 18, or 16 and 16, sorry. If it's basic, which is the C grade, 18, 18, 7, 13 and 13. And then unsatisfactory, which is less than a D, is going to be 14, 14, 5, 10, and 10. So one of the things I want to take away from this is that the peer comments are worth a total of 40% of your grade on your discussion. So you want to be sure you get those 3 responses in. And you want to be sure that they address what they're supposed to address in the guided responses. Okay, so in both categories, peer comments and top post, general knowledge means the use of actual history and historical examples to support your ideas. And this means using as many examples as you can, specific examples with your citation, and it means making a good argument. Critical thinking in both of these has to do with your sourcing. And what I mean by that is that you're going to need to use most, if not all, of the required sources for the week, which means the readings and the videos. Now, I know that this week there were a lot of sources. And I say that having just made the quiz for you, so I know that there was a lot to have to read. But what I want to see is that you used most of them, and that you certainly use them to bring in the different ideas. Part of what critical thinking is going to be doing is also using ideas historiographically, as in talking about how this is a traditional view, but now we also think about it this way, or bringing up different interpretations of the same event, or discussing the bias and perspective of either your secondary source authors, such as your textbook and your videos, or primary sources when we get to those, which we will. But the idea therein is to use these different ideas. In the peer comments, the critical thinking is going to go towards using other sources and other ideas from what you used in your top post. And if you did the discussion as directed, then each of your peer comments should have been addressing one of the other questions. And since I don't know how big this class is, it had more people in it the first day, and I'm not sure how many are there, and I know that we've added some people. With that in mind, if you don't see one of the questions answered, you may respond to one of your peers that maybe answered one of the other different questions, addressing whatever question neither one of you answered, so that you both benefit from it. That would also allow them then to talk about that as well. So just because no one else answered a certain question does not mean that you shouldn't address it in some form in your peer responses. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to close the discussion rubric, and we're going to go to the actual questions from this Learning Module 1, The World Before Columbus. All right, so the first question, why is the Renaissance a rebirth? Well, it's a rebirth because Western Europe had lost touch with a lot of its own history after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. In the period of the Crusades, when many Western Europeans made their way to the East in hopes of militarily reclaiming the Holy Land, they encountered a lot of these Greek and Roman ideas because all of those other civilizations, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughals, even the Chinese, all of these people still had recourse to that information and that learning because their civilizations didn't die. They continued on. And in fact, one of the things that comes out of that is that these peoples had further built on that knowledge to create other political systems, to create greater knowledge of science and medicine and technology and all of these things that Western Europeans encounter. So in that sense, it is a rebirth only in the Western world, or it's just a return of the information from the past to the people who lost it because of the collapse of society. In what ways could people during the Renaissance be described as modern as opposed to medieval? Well, if you read the art and the literature, then you know that perspective changed. They, to a certain extent, particularly humanists, began to question this absolute faith in the structure of the church, not in Christianity. And I think that's very important to understand. They questioned the power of the people, of the administration of the church. And they began to think that there were other ways to interpret the world that didn't necessarily preclude God or their religious beliefs, but did reject the power of the church. Political, cultural, and artistic changes, obviously with art, we talk a lot about realism or materialism coming into play. Politically, we began to see in the Italian city-states, you began to get republics, you begin to get different interpretations of how to operate a government, but you also begin to get the rise of nation states, which are political entities in which people associate themselves with the nation as opposed to the kingdom. They begin to shift from being loyal to the king to being loyal to this idea of a unity amongst themselves or a nation. And culturally, of course, you see the rise of humanism. You see the idea that the world is different from individual to individual and how they interpret it. Was it actually a rebirth of learning for the world? No, it was not, but it was for Western Europe. Because everywhere else in the world still had all this information. If you watched the Indian Ocean trade video from John Green, then you know that the standard of living through the rest of the world was infinitely higher than it was in Western Europe, and he even makes that point. All right. Compare Western Europe in the 13th and 14th to the rest of Eurasia. Where was the standard of living higher and why? Why was Europe wanting to get into the Asian trading network? How did they go about doing it and why? Okay, that's going to bring you into a lot about the Venetians and the Ottomans, or about the city-states in Italy, which see a rise in their wealth because they enter into trade trying to bring those commodities that they learned about in the Crusades into Europe, but they do this by water, by connecting mostly with the Ottomans on the Mediterranean being the last overland point of contact for goods coming out of the rest of Eurasia, making it cheaper for the Italians to bring them across the Mediterranean to Italy, the Italian city-states, and then from there spreading them back into the rest of Europe. The highest standard of living was probably in Mughal India, or the Ottoman or Safavid Persian empires, or China. Why? Because they still had a great and extensive trade network. They still shared ideas, as John Green points out in that video, the transfer of ideas and religions from people in the middle class, not necessarily in the upper classes, whereas in Europe, almost all the wealth was still concentrated at the top. Why was Europe wanting to get into the Asian trading networks? To get those things that they had didn't have access to, these commodities that they considered to be precious, spices, silks, sugar, but that were so expensive because they were all having to come in overland until the Venetians and the Florentines got a monopoly on them, bringing them in by water. How did they go about doing it and why? Well, that's a big part of what we see in the rest of the section on the development of nation states. Most of the kingdoms began to consolidate. They began, particularly Spain and Portugal, began to send out and to invest in scientific exploration in the way of the development of new marine technology. The Portuguese are going to go around Africa to try to get into India, whereas the Spanish, Ferdinand and Isabella, will invest in Columbus to try to get him to go effectively west to attempt to find a water route. So that's going to be their method. Okay, and then what is a nation state and how does it differ from a kingdom? Well, first and foremost, as I mentioned just a minute ago, it transfers from the idea of loyalty to a king to loyalty to an identity. And that identity is that of people who share a similar language, similar religions, similar culture and traditions. A lot of it has to do with the development of bureaucracy as well. And this is part of what we see come out of the rise of the Black Death. The textbook mentions that one of the ironic things that happens with the Black Death is that with the great decline of the population by up to about 1/3, it made peasants more important. The people doing the hard manual work become more significant. And so their pay has to rise, their taxes have to lower, all the things that were necessary to get them to become productive again in this, basically for most people in Europe, post-apocalyptic age. And actually, to be fair, throughout the world. If you watch the John Green video on trade in this period, he mentions the Mongolian states, which had existed up until the Black Death. And these were huge states. China was controlled by the Yuan, who were a Mongol dynasty. There were 3 Mongol Khanates that controlled much of Russia and much of Southeast Asia. All of these disintegrate with the Black Death because so many people die, and it literally destroys their economic and political infrastructure. All right, so in Europe, we get the rise of the nation state out of this because kings began to develop in order to try to become less dependent on the aristocracy. They start developing bureaucratic systems. They develop bureaucratized tax structure, which takes the power away from the hands of the aristocrats to develop or to impose taxes and get them to the king, and puts it in the hands of bureaucracy specially designed to do that. It takes away the power of that aristocracy to feud or to fight with kings and to control monarchies, and makes it so that taxes are more evenly distributed and more easily controlled by the king, but also gives the peasants more access to the government itself. They also begin to develop, they being kings, also to begin to develop standing armies and standing bureaucratic structures, which means that, again, the kings are no longer as dependent on the aristocrats to fight wars. Now they have gunpowder weapons. That's part of what we see in the 1300s and 1400s is the spread of gunpowder. And with that, the need for the militaries to know how to operate that gunpowder, because we're talking big siege weapons and big cannons. And this requires more specialization, more training, and the need to have a standing army on hand all the time. The most common form of government in the world from the 1300s to 1400s was still monarchy, and you see this everywhere. But it's different types of monarchies and different types of constructions of how to rule. We see a lot of empires in this period, particularly in Central and Southeast Asia, but we're going to begin to see them develop in the Western European world. And a lot of that is because of Columbus's discovery of the Western Hemisphere. And this is going to lead to the creation initially of a huge Spanish empire, and a Portuguese empire. The Portuguese empire will effectively be what's called a trading post empire. While they do get control of Brazil in the Western Hemisphere, they also, though, began to expand around Africa, establishing trading posts in their desire to get commodities out of Central Africa, particularly gold, ivory, and things like that. But also they began trading in slaves, and that's going to begin the function of the transatlantic slave trade, which starts with the Portuguese, but then is going to expand markedly as the Spanish and the Portuguese begin to need people to work in their colonized areas to produce particularly and notably sugar and coffee and very highly intensive agricultural products. Why does the idea of the nation state arise in Europe? A lot of that has to do with the feuding and competition between the various kingdoms and the need for many of these kingdoms, particularly France and Spain, to consolidate their states, to get the people behind them, again, at the expense of other aristocrats. Were Europeans that notably different from other peoples? Not really. If you look back in the histories of China, India, the Persian Empire, you'll see a lot of the same thing happen. It's just that it happens much earlier. For Western Europeans, they're behind the times, literally, because they lost the Western Roman Empire in the 400s and then had to deal with putting themselves back together, which literally takes about 800 years. What is the relationship between government and religion in the world in the 1300s and 1400s? It's very central. Religion is the basis for the governments. It's one of the things that ties them together. How is Europe different? And is it different? Well, it's different in that it's practicing Roman Catholicism. In Eastern Europe, you have Byzantine or Orthodox Christianity, which will dominate in Russia and in certain other areas, also known as Greek Orthodoxy and then later Russian Orthodoxy. In the Safavid Persian Empire, you have Islam as well as in the Ottoman Empire. But one is Shia Islam, Safavid Persia, and the other is Sunni Islam, the Ottoman Empire, which are two different interpretations in much the same way that Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodox / Roman Orthodox are different interpretations of Christianity. In other parts of the world, like China, you have Confucianism coupled with Buddhism. In India, you have Buddhism, but it is and you have Hinduism. You have Buddhism in passing. It's beginning to move out as the Mughal Empire brings in Islam. How does the relationship between government and religion intersect with commerce and trade? Well, I think John Green, again, in his Indian Ocean trade video, does a really good job of discussing how religion moves and how it becomes tied to people who are directly trading, the merchant class, etc., who often, in certain areas, begin to switch religions because it makes it easier to work with the people with whom they're trading. In Western Europe and in some of the bigger Euro-Asian empires, there is the belief in absolutism that the king is given the right to rule by God. And you're going to see this in China, where they have what's called the mandate of heaven, the idea that the people have a right to revolt when a government becomes, or an emperor stops taking care of his people, becomes more self-centered on himself or the people around him than he does about the people as a whole. And this is part of what is called the Chinese dynastic cycle. In India, you have the Mughals who have moved in and consolidated and taken over. The ruling class there is Muslim, but they are ruling over a primarily Hindu population, and eventually that's going to become a problem. In Europe, you're going to see the relationship between Catholicism and rule splinter, and that's going to be because of the Reformation, where you're going to see England particularly convert to Protestantism, partly as a mechanism by which to thwart the power of the papacy. That's what Henry VIII did. He wanted that divorce, but he also wanted to curb the wealth of the church that was coming out of England, and he wanted to keep it for himself. And then later, his daughter, Elizabeth, is going to take full control of England as a Protestant nation, and in fact is going to demand that even though she has no children of her own, when the Stuarts come in as her appointed heirs, that they're going to maintain Protestantism, particularly the Church of England, as the central sanctioned religion of the government in England itself. That, of course, though, is going to lead to many of the problems that create the English Civil Wars, as the Stuarts, particularly the sons, don't adhere to the agreement that their father, James I, made, and want to convert England back to Catholicism. And that's going to be one of the central tenets of the English Civil Wars, followed by the idea of how much power Parliament can have, and ultimately Parliament will win, and that's where in 1689 we get the literal English, the Constitution of Englishmen, as it were, that literally stipulates the rights of Englishmen, written, as it were, by one of our favorites, John Locke. All right, so those are the main hits on the big four questions. Again, your top post for all of your discussions will be due on Friday, which means the one this week, top post is due Friday, and the peer comments are due by Monday. I encourage you to look at it and to consider which one you want to answer, but also be aware that you have to address the other questions as well in your peer comments. All right, so this is our basic introduction for the first week, and the how I grade, and also the historiography and bias and sourcing discussion we needed to have. I'm posting this so that those of you who are new to the class have it. Those of you who are old to the class will also have access to it, and it will be here for the rest of the semester for you to look at and to think about when you discuss how I grade. You will now have until, I think I set it until 5 o'clock, the end of our class period, but I think I'm going to reset it until midnight to do the first quiz. Now, you only have one attempt at the first quiz, so you can't stop in the middle of it and leave. I encourage you to pay attention to the questions. They are based on the readings and the videos for this week. So if there's anything you didn't see or watch or read in the course of doing your discussion, and I know some of you didn't because many of you don't have the all the sites, all the works cited stuff that you need. I encourage you to do that prior to taking the quiz, but the quiz will close at midnight tonight. So this is what we're doing today. You're going to watch this video, you're going to do the quiz, and then you're going to start looking at the second discussion questions. And if you have questions, email me. I inversely am going to be looking at who has attended and who hasn't attended, and who's done the course agreement and who hasn't, so that I can drop the people who are not participating. All right. I look forward to hearing from you if you have questions, and I'll try to be getting your first discussions graded and back to you over the weekend. If the weather is bad, we will see each other when we see each other. All right. Thank you.